For most people, February 14 is a day filled with love, romance, and grand gestures. But beneath the roses and candlelit dinners lurks a darker side of Valentine's Day, one marked by mystery, tragedy, and even murder. Take, for instance, one of the most infamous killings in history, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. On February 14, 1929, Chicago's underworld was rocked when 7 men, believed to be a part of a rival gang, were ruthlessly gunned down. An act widely attributed to Al Capone's men, the brutal execution forever linked the holiday of love with bloodshed of betrayal. And that's just the beginning. Throughout history, Valentine's Day has been the backdrop for chilling unsolved mysteries, many likely fueled with passion, jealousy, and heartbreak. Here are 10 eerie cases that prove love and tragedy often go hand in hand. Hi, I'm Alina. Welcome to or welcome back to my channel. Valentine's Day is supposed to be a day of love and connection, but for Hart and Serrin, February 14, 2007 became a night of unimaginable horror, one that still haunts them to this day. That evening, the Serrins drove to their 39-year-old daughter Jodine's condo for a routine check-in. Jodine, who was mentally disabled, lived independently but relied on frequent visits from her parents. When they arrived, they found the lights on, but something was off. The front door was locked from the inside with a security chain. After calling out her name and getting no response, Hart forced the door open, stepping into the dimly lit apartment, unaware that he was about to stumble upon a nightmare. As he entered Jodine's bedroom, shock gripped him. There, in the darkness, was his daughter, engaged in what happened to be a sexual act with an unidentified man. Startled and furious, Hart demanded that the man get dressed and leave immediately. He and Lois stepped away, giving their daughter privacy, never imagining that their momentary retreat would give a killer the chance to slip away. Minutes passed. Jodine never came out. Growing concerned, the Serrins returned to the bedroom, only to be met with a sight no parent should ever have to see. Jodine lay motionless on the bed, her lifeless body stripped of dignity. She had been beaten and strangled to death. What made the crime even more chilling was its brazenness. Jodine's killer had committed the murder while her parents were still inside the condo. Somehow, in those brief moments when Hart and Lois stepped away, he had managed to kill her and disappear without a trace. Disturbingly, investigators later considered the possibility that the Serrins had unknowingly walked in on Jodine being assaulted rather than a consensual encounter. DNA evidence was collected from the scene, offering a crucial lead, but to this day, her murderer remains unidentified, a ghost that slipped through the cracks of justice. Years later, the case of Jodine Serrin still remains unsolved, a grim reminder that some of the darkest crimes happen in the most unexpected places, even on a day meant for love. What started as a whirlwind romance ended in a chilling mystery, one that remains unsolved to this day. In February 1988, English furniture dealer David Sims traveled to the Philippines for business and returned with more than just trade deals. He came back with a wife. Her name was China Rose, a woman 20 years his junior, and the newlyweds settled into their new life in Southend, England. But the honeymoon phase didn't last. As time went on, China confided in her sister that her marriage turned into a nightmare. She spoke of David's growing violence, his temper, and most disturbingly, his threats. According to China, David had chillingly remarked that hiring a hitman would be cheaper than a divorce. Then came Valentine's Day 1993. China attended a family party, laughing, celebrating, but it would be the last time anyone saw her alive. Not long after, she vanished. No goodbyes, no explanation, though she had previously mentioned wanting to return to the Philippines to see her ailing father. She never reached out to her family again. And the mystery deepened when David Sims also disappeared. 2 months after China's last known sighting, David was spotted at their home. Then, like his wife, he was gone. He cut off contact with everyone, including his own daughters from a previous marriage. It was as if the earth had swallowed both of them whole. Years later, a key figure emerged. Jeffrey Paston, a former housemate of the couple. Paston revealed that David had asked him to sell the house and transfer the money into an account under the alias Anthony Peter Lewis. £40,000 was later withdrawn by a mysterious man claiming to represent David, but at least £10,000 remained untouched, a ghost account belonging to a man who had seemingly vanished. With no sign of China or David, the case remains one of eerie speculation. Was China murdered as she feared? Did David orchestrate his own disappearance? Or is the truth even more twisted than anyone suspects? For now, all that's left are unanswered questions and a trail gone cold. On the morning of Valentine's Day 1986, Stephen Geri left his Houston home, as he did every day, heading to work. His wife, 33-year-old Marilu, was still in bed, or so he claimed. A few hours later, Stephen had called Marilu's mother, Maria Serrato, from his office, sounding concerned. Marilu wasn't answering the phone, he said, and he asked Maria to stop by their home to help Marilu get ready for a party that day. But when Maria arrived, she didn't find her daughter preparing for a celebration. Instead, she walked into a nightmare. Marilu had been shot 4 times, her body riddled with bullets from 2 different guns, a .38 and a .22. There were no signs of a break-in, no indication of a robbery. Whoever had killed her had likely been someone she knew. Suspicion quickly turned towards Stephen. While Stephen owned multiple handguns, none were identified as the murder weapons, and he appeared to have an alibi. But something about his actions that day raised eyebrows. He had left the house unusually early, making a series of seemingly random stops: a 7-Eleven, a post office, a donut shop. Stranger still, the very next day, he returned to each of those locations, reminding employees that he had been there the morning before, as if making sure they remembered. Then there was the matter of $400,000 life insurance policy Stephen had taken out on Marilu. Her parents, convinced of his involvement, took him to court to prevent him from collecting the payout, though an out-of-court settlement was reached. Its details remain sealed, leaving lingering questions about what really happened. To this day, Stephen Geri insists he had nothing to do with Marilu's death, but with no arrests, no definitive answers, and a trail of suspicions that never quite faded. The murder of Marilu Geri remains a chilling Valentine's Day mystery, one that may never be solved. On the morning of February 13, 1990, Glenn Hayward set out on a simple, heartfelt mission to pick wildflowers for his wife as a Valentine's Day surprise. But what was meant to be an act of love turned into a moment of horror. Walking through a neglected field behind a Greenville, South Carolina mall, Hayward tread carefully through a landscape littered with discarded junk. The area was an illegal dumping ground, filled with all kinds of abandoned items. Then, amid the debris, something unusual caught his eye. A large Sears vacuum cleaner box. Foul odor lingered in the air. Curious, Hayward pried the box open and instantly recoiled in shock. Inside lay the tiny, lifeless body of a newborn baby girl, her fragile form wrapped in a blanket and newspaper. Her umbilical cord was still attached, and the placenta remained beside her. Stark reminders of a life that had only just begun before it was cruelly taken away. Investigators determined that the baby had been born healthy around 5 days before her discovery and had lived for roughly 2 days. There were traces of food in her stomach, suggesting that someone had cared for her at least for a short while. Yet no one came forward to claim her. No one could explain how she ended up abandoned in a box, left to perish in a desolate field, with no identity to tie her to. The infant was given a name by the community, Julie Valentine, a heartbreaking tribute to the love she never had the chance to receive. A potential clue emerged when witnesses reported seeing a man in a red Pontiac Fiero parked near the site 3 days before the discovery. But who he was and whether he had anything to do with Julie's tragic fate remains a mystery. Decades later, Julie Valentine is still nameless, her story still unfinished. Until someone steps forward, until DNA unlocks her past, she will remain a haunting question mark in the history of Greenville. Nearly a year later, after the Columbine High School massacre shook the nation, tragedy struck the community once again. This time, it wasn't inside the school, but the horror was just as chilling. It was the early hours of Valentine's Day 2000. A subway employee passing by the shop noticed something strange. The lights were still on, even though the store had closed hours earlier. Curious and concerned, she stepped inside. What she found would haunt her forever. Behind the counter lay the lifeless body of 15-year-old Nicholas Kunselman and his 16-year-old girlfriend Stephanie Hart. Both had been shot to death. Nicholas had been working the late shift that night. Stephanie had stopped by to visit him as he closed up, but at some point they had been ambushed, executed in cold blood. The crime scene offered few clues. There was no sign of a robbery. The only lead? A mysterious man in a red jacket, seen walking away from the shop shortly before the bodies were discovered. As investigators searched for answers, an eerie connection emerged. One of the first victims of the Columbine massacre, Rachel Scott, had worked at the very same subway before she was killed in a school shooting. It was a chilling coincidence, one that only deepened the community's sense of unease. The case took another twist when police uncovered a drug ring operated in the area. Some speculated that the murders were drug-related, though there was never any concrete proof. Stephanie's mother even attempted to sue the shop's owner, claiming he allowed illegal drug activity on the premises. The lawsuit failed, but the question lingered. Did Nicholas and Stephanie stumble upon something they weren't supposed to see? More than 2 decades later, the killer remains unidentified, and justice remains out of reach. The Valentine's Day murders of Nicholas Kunselman and Stephanie Hart remain one of Colorado's most haunting unsolved crimes, a reminder that sometimes the answers never come. Valentine's Day is meant to be a day of romance, but for 41-year-old Maureen Fields, February 14, 2006 was filled with dread. When she arrived for work at the Wells Fargo Bank in Pahrump, Nevada, her co-workers immediately noticed something was off. Maureen seemed anxious, unsettled, as if she knew something terrible was about to happen. In a chilling remark, she told them something's going to happen. The next day, Maureen vanished. According to her husband, Paul Fields, she had left home that morning for work, but she never made it there. A day later, her abandoned car was discovered deep in the Mojave Desert near Death Valley, stuck in a sand. Inside were her purse and personal belongings, scattered as if left in a hurry. A pair of pantyhose lay nearby, along with a blanket stained with blood and vomit. Even more disturbing was an empty Xanax pill bottle, found at the scene, wiped completely clean of fingerprints. Investigators initially considered suicide, suspecting she may have wandered into the desert, succumbed to the elements. But with no body and too many suspicious details, the theory quickly fell apart. The scene felt staged. DNA recovered from the pantyhose offered a potential lead. The husband police had their eyes on. Then, in 2012, an unexpected break came. The DNA belonged to a convicted sex offender, an elderly man named Keith Wayne Holmes. Holmes, when questioned, admitted to having consensual sex with Maureen before leaving her alone in a desert. But could he be trusted? Holmes also claimed he knew Paul Fields, an eerie connection that only deepened the mystery. By then, however, dementia had clouded Holmes' memory, leaving investigators with nothing but contradiction. Whatever he knew, he took to his grave when he died in prison hospice care in 2014. To this day, Paul Fields remains the prime suspect, yet no concrete evidence ever tied him to his wife's disappearance. Did Maureen's cryptic warning to her co-workers. Mean she saw this coming? Did she meet her fate at the hands of her husband? Or did Holmes play a more sinister role that he let on? Nearly 2 decades later, the truth about Maureen Fields is still buried somewhere in a Nevada desert, waiting to be uncovered. On the evening of February 14, 2014, 17-year-old Antonio Saldivar set out on what should have been a simple, heartfelt mission. He borrowed his mother's car to deliver a teddy bear to his girlfriend for Valentine's Day, but he never made it to her house, and by the end of that night, Antonio had vanished without a trace. As the hours passed and Antonio missed his curfew, his mother grew increasingly worried. She called and texted him repeatedly, but there was no response. Finally, at 4 a.m., he answered. His voice on the line was brief but reassuring. He was on his way home, but he never made it. Less than 30 minutes later, his mother's car was found wrecked against a concrete pillar. The impact had totaled the vehicle. There was something even more unsettling. Antonio was gone. The car was empty, yet his shoes were still inside. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. For nearly 2 weeks, Antonio remained missing. Then, on February 27, a worker at a Texas port recycling scrap metal plant made a chilling discovery. Antonio's body, submerged underwater beneath a dock in the Houston Ship Channel, nearly 2 miles from the crash site. At first glance, it seemed like a tragic accident. Maybe he had been dazed from the crash, wandered away and drowned. But the details surrounding his death raised far more questions than answers. For one, Antonio never actually arrived at his girlfriend's house that night. The teddy bear meant for her was later found, stuffed between his legs inside his pen. A witness later claimed to have seen a dark SUV force Antonio's car into the pillar, hinting at something far more sinister. And perhaps most disturbingly, Antonio's body was discovered in a secure area of the scrap metal plant, an area completely inaccessible to search volunteers who had been scouring the city for him. How did he end up there? And if someone had put him there, why? Antonio Saldivar's death remains a haunting mystery, and his family is still searching for the truth. For Cassandra Rundle and her 2 children, February 14, 1985 became the setting of an unthinkable tragedy, one that remains a haunting mystery to this day. Cassandra, a 37-year-old mother of 2, had already been through 2 divorces, but was building a life for herself in Colorado Springs with her children, 12-year-old Detrick and 10-year-old Melanie. That morning, her second ex-husband arrived at her home with a Valentine's Day gift, an innocent gesture of kindness. But when he stepped inside, he was met with a scene of pure horror. Cassandra's lifeless nude body lay in her bed, bound and brutalized. In the next room, little Melanie was found in her own bed, suffering the same horrific fate. Her skull fractured from a violent struggle. The brutality didn't stop there. 12-year-old Detrick was discovered in his own bedroom, beaten to death. Beside him lay a bloodied hockey stick, the weapon that had been used to bludgeon all 3 victims. Investigators pieced together a chilling story. Detrick may have stepped outside that morning, unknowingly returning home while the killer was still inside. Did he walk into the middle of the slaughter, forced to witness the unimaginable before meeting his own tragic end? The case baffled authorities. In the months before her murder, Cassandra had placed personal ads in a local newspaper, receiving more than 80 responses and interacting with several men. Could one of them have been her killer? Despite extensive investigation, no connection was ever made. Another chilling lead pointed to Philip Wilkinson, a former soldier now sitting on a death row for the 1992 triple murder of a mother and her 2 children. The crimes were eerily similar, but no concrete link to the Rundle murders has ever been found. Decades later, the brutal slaying of Cassandra, Melanie, and Detrick remains unsolved. A terrifying reminder that some nightmares never end. Who was the monster behind this massacre? And why, after all these years, has justice remained elusive? On Valentine's Day in 1984, 24-year-old Marcy Jo Andrews and two friends attended a lively party at Casey Nowicki's Chicago apartment. The night seemed like any other until tragedy struck. On the way back, Nowicki lost control of his car, crashing into a viaduct. Andrews injured her ankle in a wreck. As Nowicki handed over his car keys to her friends, instructed them to call for a tow truck, he offered to take her to the hospital in a taxi. Marcy's friends would never see her again. Later that night, they called Nowicki's apartment, reaching Andrews on the phone. Her voice trembled with fear, telling them she hadn't been taken to the hospital as promised. It was the last time they ever heard from her. In the following days, the women tried to visit Nowicki's apartment, but each time he claimed that Andrews had already left. He refused to let them inside. When the police got involved, Nowicki stuck to his story, insisting he had no knowledge of what happened to Marcy. It wasn't until 2000 that Nowicki was finally charged with Marcy Jo Andrews' murder. The prosecution's chilling story was that Nowicki had taken her back to his apartment, where he drugged her with THC to keep her compliant while he sexually assaulted her repeatedly. A series of witnesses came forward, claiming they had seen Andrews in Nowicki's apartment in the days after the crash. One key witness, Michael John Panisi, provided harrowing testimony. He claimed to have seen Andrews naked and handcuffed to a radiator, only to witness her lifeless body lying on the floor. Panisi stated that Nowicki had intentionally overdosed Andrews THC before disposing of her body. Nowicki's defense team fought back, arguing that the prosecution's witnesses were unreliable. Many had criminal records and were allegedly given deals in exchange for their testimony. Despite the defense's efforts, the jury convicted Nowicki, sentencing him to life in prison. But even in the face of justice, there was a haunting mystery that lingered. Marcy Jo Andrews' body has never been found. On February 14, 1992, Billy and Cindy Trimbach celebrated their love in a small town of Stoneham, Colorado, tying the knot in what seemed like the perfect union. But just 1 year later, on their first anniversary, the promise of a lifetime together was shattered in the most horrifying way imaginable. Billy was found shot to death, his lifeless body discarded by the side of a remote frontage road near Wiggins, about 50 miles from Stoneham. But the story took an eerie twist. The sheriff investigating the case had unknowingly driven past the very spot where Billy's body lay, just moments before it was discovered. He recalled seeing multiple vehicles parked nearby, possibly unaware that one of them belonged to Billy's killer, who had been in the process of dumping the body. As investigators pieced together the crime, all signs pointed to one shocking suspect, Billy's wife, Cindy. The motive was chillingly clear. She had recently collected a $500,000 life insurance policy on her husband's death. Even more damning was the physical evidence found in Cindy's car, suggesting that Billy's body had been inside it at some point before it was discarded. With suspicion swirling around her, Cindy fled Stoneham and moved with her 10-year-old son James to Montana, hoping to escape the dark cloud hanging over her. But the story was far from over. In April 1994, a local newspaper published an article about Billy's unsolved murder, mentioning Cindy as a prime suspect. James, already struggling with the weight of his family's troubled past, became the target of cruel teasing at school, and 11-year-old classmate Jeremy Bullock taunted him mercilessly about his mother's potential role in the murder. But the taunting went too far. In a shocking moment of rage, James pulled out a gun and shot Jeremy dead. The young boy was sent to a juvenile detention center. His life forever changed by the violence that had been inflicted on his family. As time passed, rumors about Billy's murder swirled. Some speculated that Cindy had hired someone to carry out the crime. Whispers about a drug dealer who had allegedly boasted about being involved. Yet, despite the decades that have gone by, the full truth of Billy Trimbach's death remains a mystery, one that continues to haunt those connected to it. In 1996, Cindy Trimbach passed away from natural causes, but the legacy of the tragedy she may have played a part in endures. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.